Welcome to Energy Thinks, a podcast about the oil and gas industry's role in the energy future. I'm Tisha Schuller, your host and the CEO of Adamantine Energy. I am coming to you with a solo podcast today. I have been doing a lot of traveling. I'm finishing up writing the book, The Myth and the Moment, and I'm going to tell you all about it. Before I get into the particulars, if you haven't subscribed to my weekly newsletter and you like the kind of things we're discussing here, please go to energythinks.com or Substack and subscribe to both of these things are true. If you'd like to know more about what we're doing at Adamantine Energy, you can check that out at our website. So it's dark 30 here in Colorado. So dark that as I set up to record this, my alarm went off, but I just woke up ready to go. So I thought I would give you a little update on what's going on. I am so glad that you all are enjoying the solo podcast format because with all the changes with the Trump administration coming in, I really felt like I needed to rework the outline for The Myth and the Moment, the book I'm writing. And the solo podcast is a great way to test out ideas. And it's been so fun to hear from you, the listeners, and get your feedback. So thank you for that. I will return at some point to the interview format, but it might be a little bit because I am working really hard to finish the draft of the book. So I leave tomorrow for spring break with my family. I'm pretty psyched about that. And it's so early and I'm so motivated that even the dog and the cat wouldn't get out of bed. But I wanted to get this done before I go down to town for my morning swim. So thank you for sharing this time with me. So those of you who have been listening to the podcast know that we all find ourselves at a moment. And in this moment, the myth of an easy energy transition has really been laid bare, that it is in fact mythical. And everywhere I go, I have been encountering the ramifications of this. And it's so interesting and exciting. And so in the last, since I last recorded for you, I have traveled twice a week for the last 3 weeks. And included in that were 3 pretty interesting and intense meetings, which I wanted to tell you about. So our firm gathers energy leaders who work on decarbonization initiatives for oil and gas companies, a consortium. So we had a 2-day meeting with that group. I went to a Chatham House Rule gathering of people who are focused on climate action, mostly kind of center lefty political, some center right. And the purpose of that was really to talk about how to continue to make progress on climate action during the Trump administration. So that was really interesting. And then I went to what can only be described as the Disney cruise of oil and gas, which was CERAWeek, where for those of you who were there, just know that it's this exhilarating, exhausting experience where if you just walk around, you can do a year's worth of networking in approximately 24 hours. So I spent 72 hours there. So let's just say I did 3 years of networking. So there were a lot of common themes, but I think it can be really confusing right now. And so I want to digest all of this input into some actionable ideas for you. And as always, what we're doing here is I'm testing them out. And so I reserve the right to change my mind and be wrong, rare as that might be. And I would love to hear what you think. It's really fun to get your notes back about how you're digesting the information and how you're responding to this format of the podcast. All right, so let's start with what's going on out there. What's going on with companies, with climate-centric, environmental-centric NGOs, and all of those out there who are thinking and working in this space. So let's start with my takeaways from having a lot of meetings with executives from companies. Here we find ourselves in the Trump administration with a lot happening, of course, in a short amount of time, but also this sense that like the world has changed and it's changed forever. But if we think back just 10 years, you can remember that the political winds have shifted 3 times. So the Obama administration to the Trump 1 administration to the Biden administration, and then back to the Trump 2 administration. So companies need to plan at least 10 years. Because for the obvious reasons that it takes a long time to permit and build and operate infrastructure and those investments. So there's this understanding that the time horizon that we're thinking about isn't now. It's something that transcends this particular political moment. There's also a real visceral pressure, I would say unspoken in most cases, to toe the line. And I think we can all feel that. I saw in a Wall Street Journal article recently that companies are pushing back on tariffs in private. There's a real sense of vulnerability of speaking out against any action of this administration. And of course, that's interesting because reporters or activists will say, to me, the oil and gas industry is getting everything at once. Why aren't they speaking out? And I would just say, one, I don't think anyone's getting everything they want. And two, it would be very irresponsible for someone with fiduciary responsibility to a company to speak out right now in this environment. There's a real interesting dynamic going on there that I think it's important for us all to understand. And privately, there's a real concern about the help, and I use help with air quotes, that this administration is offering to the industry. It's because I think we all know if we work in the oil and gas industry that things like the endangerment finding, which is what the EPA uses for rationale to regulate greenhouse gas emissions, or rolling back methane rules, for example, this undermines the public's confidence that the oil and gas industry is, in fact, a responsible actor and well regulated. And so the idea that the industry wants this or is asking for this or is getting what it wants is, I think, something that thoughtful leaders know can be pretty short-sighted. And is something we're going to probably have to spend years regaining some confidence about some of these changes. Now, of course, there's bias in the company I keep. So there are company leaders who are probably celebrating all this and roll it all back. But those aren't the ones I tend to be hanging out with. I guess the final thing I'll say about what the world looks like to companies is that there's a really challenging environment around decarbonization projects because the path to permitting, to public acceptance, it was difficult before. And now it's really difficult. So for those in my audience for this podcast who are, say, work for environmental think tanks or environmental NGOs, it's really important to understand that companies have to rationalize their work in an environment where there was a lot of opposition to, say, CCS or hydrogen from ENGOs, for example. And then now there's not a sense of momentum in the public sphere. It's really hard for companies to rationalize these projects. Now, they still are and they still will, but this is a dynamic that I think we all need to understand. A little bit more on that in a bit. All right. And then what does the world look like to what I refer to as the climate hawks? So the really smart, really committed people who understand the complexity of addressing climate and want to work towards nuanced, inclusive solutions. I would say this is the group I spent some time with at a meeting, several days. So this was pretty interesting because many of you in the audience fall into this category as well. So the overall, I think Democrats, left-leaning people are reeling from what feels like a repudiation by the public of the left, of the, again, air quotes, the elite of climate action. I would argue maybe it's climate apocalypse narration. But good Democrats are really adrift. And you have a sense from this about just from reading the paper. But private conversations, there's really just a sense of how do we respond? I think it's very healthy that many people who work in this space recognize that the voters are not with them, and that requires a shift. Now, of course, there is a reaction from, let's say, many well-meaning climate activists that I will tell you, this will sound familiar to you. We have to tell our story better. And I think this is really interesting Because anyone who's worked in oil and gas for a long time knows that for the last, 15 years, we've been saying we have to tell our story better. And it was super interesting to be in a number of rooms where climate activists were saying we have to tell our story better. Now, what most people mean by that is we have to make climate sound scarier. We didn't appropriately scare everyone. I, of course, think that's ill-advised. I've been arguing that for, at least 5 years, maybe 15 years. But it is interesting, again, kind of like where woke went wrong. I invite you to think about this idea of the parallels between how we react and how we can see that maybe the way we correct to public adversity, public opinion, isn't always super great. So there's that reaction, but I think there's also some pretty useful reactions, which is like, we need to understand what the population of the United States wants. We need to build broader coalitions. The Democratic coalition, as everyone knows, really fell apart. But I would say I don't see a real broad recognition yet that this will require businesses. This will require big industry. This will require, I think, of course, staked my career on it, the oil and gas industry. So there's still a sense of like, we need to build our coalition, but it still looks and sounds a lot like the old coalitions. And I really want us in the oil and gas industry to be thinking about this and thinking about how to meet our future partners halfway. Because here's something that's really important to know. Those who have worked with industry in the past, so, the pragmatic NGOs that will partner with the oil and gas industry, they feel really, really vulnerable right now. There is a sense out in the world that the oil and gas industry is getting everything it asked for. And if you were an NGO that worked with oil and gas, you're hearing a lot. We told you. We told you they didn't mean it. We told you they didn't mean action on climate and embracing regulation. And so it's going to be really important that we as an industry reach out, engage with those partners and understand, both the sort of lostness, but also the sense of betrayal. And I am not saying that you company leaders are responsible for this general sense that the oil and gas industry is getting everything it wants, including no regulation. But it's important to understand that that's how it looks to the world. And so the burden is on us to bridge this divide of the moment. Okay. So that's what the world looks like, I think, to these various partners. So let's talk a little bit about what we do know right now. Like, what do we know in this crazy world? We know that there's a lot of political chaos. And of course, in chaos, there is opportunity. We also know that a ton of new power is going to get built. It's going to come online, and it's probably going to be, a technical term, a shit ton of natural gas. Certainly a ton getting proposed. Other sources of power also, but gas is really the accessible, reliable, affordable, quick to build. And it's interesting to see that sort of the measure of seriousness of projects is who has turbines reserved, gas turbines. That speaks to the expectation that not only is a bunch going to get built, but so much is going to get proposed that there won't be enough equipment. Now, of course, even gas that you could maybe permit and build quite quickly in 10 years. So I talked about, political wind shifting in the last 10 years. In the next 10 years, a lot of this infrastructure will not be fully built, right? Some amount of linear facilities like transmission lines or pipelines just won't be built, especially where we're talking about some emerging technology. So new low emission turbines, carbon capture, carbon sequestration. And so we have to be thinking about those political winds shifting 3 more times, right? And so we know that the current environment is temporary. And so I think that is another thing we know. So we know in chaos there's opportunity. part of that opportunity is a ton of infrastructure is going to be built. What will it look like? What kind of emissions profile will it have? How will we engage with the public and communities in that context? And what will this all look like when once again we are in a either liberal centric or climate centric or community centric world? I think this is really important to think about and what it means for you as a leader and for your company. So I have some specific suggestions for you about what to do with this. And I'm going to be writing a lot about this, and this is going to be central to my book, The Myth and the Moment. So I think two things really matter that will underpin your actions. One, oil and gas companies, all energy providers, but oil and gas companies need to continue to be focused on reducing their carbon intensity. We'll talk about that more in a minute, but just all products, the carbon intensity of all products is going to be really important. I spoke in an earlier solo episode about how in the fall, Darren Woods of ExxonMobil talked about the importance of carbon accounting and bringing this down to the product level. And I think that is a great indicator of the larger directional trend. So I think decreasing carbon intensity is going to be really important. We'll talk a little bit about what that means in a sec. And then having a commitment to decreasing absolute emissions in the world, understanding these sort of macro risks of climate, not knowing perhaps the time horizon for that. I'm not advocating for zero emissions or even negative emissions by any particular horizon, but all of us being committed to the idea of reducing absolute carbon emissions as a North Star and guide to meeting this growing energy demand is going to be really important. So two things that matter: decreasing carbon intensity of our products and being committed to the global reduction of absolute emissions. Okay. So what does this mean? What should you be doing now that you're going to need next time the political winds shift in 2 years, in 4 years, in 10 years? What are you going to need? I think two things are sort of at the heart of this. Stay the course on your emissions reductions in all its forms, and really think about your stakeholders, in particular, your community partnerships. So, and that's because these are just the two areas that you can tie, as I have always said, to your real sustainability, to your material business interests, your strategic business interests. And in the future, when your stakeholders say you didn't mean it when you made all of these climate aspirations or DEI aspirations or environmental justice commitments, back under the Biden administration, you didn't mean it. You can narrate a kind of consistent commitment to these really strategically necessary efforts. So, what does this look like now in a world where you can't even say DEI? I know canceling is getting canceled, but it also feels like an awful lot of things are getting canceled right now. But I'm going to use those three letters because I think it provides a good example of just something that is likely to reemerge and something that we need to think about. Same with environmental justice. When these concepts reemerge, what does your company strategy look like? Okay. So how could you do this in an environment where you can't say things right now, but you will need to narrate a consistent trajectory? I think this is about repackaging your commitments and repackaging. Yeah, that sounds like PR, but I'm going to challenge you. And I know it's possible, and I'll give a couple examples because we're working with companies doing this, but repackage these efforts in an authentic and durable way. So we're thinking about something that was committed to under the Biden administration, will be executed under the Trump administration, and then will need to be narrated under a future, let's just say left-leaning environment. So let me just talk through some examples of what this could look like. So one is all of your emissions reductions, your decarbonization projects These are all things that reduce the carbon intensity of your projects. So that could be oil working towards lower carbon intensity oil, maybe even future net zero oil. That could be natural gas that starts as differentiated, then becomes perhaps transitioning to a lower carbon, maybe a mixed with hydrogen, maybe a different low carbon fuel in the future. These are reducing the carbon intensity of your products. And of course, a key part of that is just keeping, as always, your emissions house in order. Now, how could you narrate this right now? Carbon intensity is a competitive advantage. It's also a national priority in terms of competitive advantage. In a world of global trade, the U.S. and of course, as you know, I would argue North American oil and natural gas resources can be the lowest carbon intensity in the world and have other competitive advantages around human rights that we can be curating, cultivating, tracking, measuring in a way that will give our resources a national competitive advantage. One might say energy dominance. So repackaging or talking about these efforts in a way that's palatable today, but also durable tomorrow. Carbon intensity, I think, is one really, really interesting thing to do. And I don't think future stakeholders will be kind to companies that did not keep their emissions house and trajectory to low and no carbon sources. I think that that's going to be really important. A second arena is how your company engages with community partnerships. So for some amount of time, environmental justice will fall out of favor. Maybe community benefits plans will be repackaged to something else. But I can tell you that 15 years ago, if you wanted to build any kind of oil and gas infrastructure in Colorado, you needed to work with your local community. And increasingly, that work became a kind of collaborative partnership informed by and meaningfully changed often by the local community. This is the ultimate risk mitigation. Having your community, or in the case of a linear facility like a pipeline, having your communities not only welcome the project, but support the project. So community engagement is going to be as important as ever. And this is just a straight up risk mitigation for your project to continue to engage with your communities as if they had the power of veto. Because if for some reason they don't today, they will again tomorrow. So that's going to be really important. Okay. And then the third thing is, how can your company be talking about climate? So I think it's going to be important to continue to build and engage in those strategic partnerships with think tanks, academics, NGOs, for whom climate is still a really important priority. Now is a great time to be building that rapport, reaching out to those partners. But you can keep talking about climate and reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. Just talk about it as a co-benefit to your other initiatives, right? Carbon intensity is a competitive advantage, reducing local air pollution, reducing other environmental footprint factors, and reducing greenhouse gas emissions, even in the absence of, let's say, federal regulations, because the endangerment finding got rolled back. It's going to be really important that companies continue to articulate in some form their commitment to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So perhaps you discuss it as a co-benefit to other material business interests. So those are 3 examples of how you can stay the course in ways that are authentic and not just palatable to this administration, but I think quite responsive to some of the interests around building and dominating the energy agenda. All right, a couple final thoughts here to wrap this up today. I've been thinking a lot about how all of this could end well. And longtime listeners know I am a sort of rabid optimist. And I think in all this chaos of this particular political moment and all the sort of upending of traditional roles, this unclear trajectory on how are we going to reduce emissions? How are we going to have climate action? I think there's a real opportunity for climate action, emissions reductions to become depolarized, less polarized. Why? Because those who are really committed to climate action are going to be interested in incremental progress and incremental solutions. And all of the above, I suspect, is about to come back into vogue in a really big way, both because of the growing power demand, but also because it's a way to get incremental progress on reducing all emissions, reducing all environmental footprints, and that will have, as I said, climate co-benefits. Now, a huge part of that could be that instead of oil and gas companies being unwelcome, perhaps if we play our cards right, we will be not only welcome, but central to these solutions and to this action. After all, the cleanest molecules in the world can, should, and will be produced in North America. And I think the idea that we would be committed to exporting these molecules around the world, along with some of our other values around human rights and democracy, you can imagine that we could ultimately play a significant role in increasing prosperity around the world. And I don't want to say that overly simplistically because we have an enormous task to raise 3 to 4 billion people out of poverty around the world. But what we do know is that as people, as countries, as communities move up the energy ladder into industrialization, into middle class, that the hierarchy of needs shifts and environmental priorities, clean air, clean water, and then climate is more abstract and moving up that ladder, but that becomes a higher priority. And so the idea that in the midst of this chaotic moment, we could be marching toward a kind of really significant progress is something that gives me a lot of hope. And that's what I'm going to keep holding on to. So this only works if each of us is relentlessly committed to progress and to the long haul and not to over committing to what feels like the priorities of this moment. So that's our episode for today. I want to thank you so much for the opportunity to chat with you. I'd love to hear what you think about this. You can reach out to us at energythinks.com. While you're there, I hope you will subscribe to my newsletter. Both of these things are true. If you like what you're hearing, please take a moment and rate this podcast. It helps other industry leaders find Energy Thinks. I'd like to thank my colleague, Kayla Chieves, for making the Energy Thinks podcast possible. Until next time, I'm Tisha Schuller, wishing you and yours happiness, prosperity, and good health.